in the Old Testament, there are 5 books of wisdom. They are Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, then Ecclesiasticus, and then the very book of wisdom. Now, if you browse through these wonderful books, they are filled with knowledge. They are filled with a lot of material for our daily life. These books speak of anger, how to overcome our foolishness, how to deal with the parents and children, how to deal with the rulers, how to pray for them, how to overcome our greed for money, greed for food. Lot of suggestions and lot of wisdom there. Precisely the book of Job does not speak anything about the daily life, but one particular theme dominates in this book is sufferings. We all look for answers for our sufferings. The only thing that we never get an answer is for our sufferings. For all others, perhaps we get answers. But when we really suffer, we always look up and say, why this thing has happened to me? Why do I suffer? What wrong have I done? What mistake I have committed? Now when we look at the book of Job, here we find here is a man rich, abundant flows in his life, riches, wealth, money. He had 7 sons, very handsome, 3 daughters, very beautiful, ravishingly beautiful, and he had 5,000 sheep, and then 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 sheep donkeys. And then what was happening daily in his life, they used to take turn to go to one another's houses to have dinners and luncheons. They used to drink wine and enjoy life. Now there is a second scene in the heavens. God calls the sons of God along with also Satan. So you might ask, why Satan? Once upon a time, Satan was the son of God. There was the Lucifer who disobeyed God, and then he becomes a bad person. He also was there in that conclave. And God says, well, have you noticed my servant Job? How good he is, how obedient he is. He never goes against the will of God. And then Satan says, well, that is very simple. You have put a wall of security around him. Nothing disturbs him. And therefore he enjoys his life. You just touch him. Just send him some sufferings. Then you will know. He will curse you. And God says, well, I don't think so. But he is in your power. Do whatever you like. And Satan goes. And disasters follow, one after another. The sheep are taken away. The camels are burnt. When his sons and daughters are in a home, when they were having a nice time, that house collapses and all of them die. And at that moment, when he loses everything, Job gets up and says, Yahweh has given, Yahweh has taken away. Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then God has the second conclave with the sons of God. And there Satan says, well, he still continues to adore you. He still continues to obey you. But you have to touch his skin and bones. Then he will curse you. And God says, well, he is in your power. Do whatever you like with him. And Satan goes and he brings upon him all sorts of sufferings, pains and sorrows. And it is said that his whole body was filled with boils and sores. He was looking awkwardly ugly. And he gets up and sits in the ash pit and cries to God saying that, Lord, what have I done to merit all this? And there comes his wife and says, well, you have lost your sons and daughters. You have lost your wealth, your livelihood. You have lost your house. And finally you have lost yourself. Your health. Look at yourself. Now what you do? The best thing is to curse God and die. Job does not do that. And there come the three friends of Job, Eliezer, Zophar and Bildad. They stand far away and they suggest something else. They say to Job, Job, you know, all these things have come upon you not because God wants to punish you. You have done something wrong. God will never punish anybody without a reason. You have sinned against God. You look to be very good outside. You were rich and enjoying life. But in your personal life, you might have sinned, and that's why God is sending you all these curses, all these tortures. But then there are three dialogues, one after another. You know, Bildad, Zophar and Eliezer speaking first, and then Job responds. And the second dialogue, three of them speak and Job responds. The third dialogue, three of them speak and Job responds. And finally, there is a whole series of lamentations on the part of Job, who says, Lord, it would have been better that I died in my mother's womb. Cursed be the day I was born. You know, all this negativity that comes out of Job. And then God answers him in a whirlwind. God answers him in a powerful storm. And God says, Job, God does not refer to his sickness and tragedies. God takes him a tour of the universe. And God says, Job, were you present when I laid down the foundations of the world? When I created the seas? When I created the stars? When I created the mountains and valleys? When I created this beautiful universe? Do you know why I created? Were you present when I created all these things? Job was not able to give an answer. And then finally, Job says, I shut my mouth because you are wise, O Lord. And there enters another personality, Elihu, who says, God is wise, God is mysterious, and God has a purpose. In all his wisdom and understanding, he allows these things in your life. So it is incomprehensible wisdom of God that comes upon man. Dear friends, this particular book is very interesting. It has 42 chapters. Chapter after chapter, it interests us because when we really suffer, we would like to get an answer from God, and we do not get an answer from God. It is something like this. Often what happens in our life, we take out the context of suffering and keep it outside and observe it, why God has allowed that particular suffering in my life. It is something like you read a book, a nice story book or a novel. You take 10 pages out of the context and read only those 10 pages. You will never get the entire context of the novel. The same way, in our life too, if we have 50 years or 60 years or 80 years or 90 years, we need to take the context of suffering in the entire episode of our life of 85 to 90 years. If you only take out those 10 years of suffering and concentrate on those 10 years, we will never be able to get an answer. But it is in the whole context of the program of God that some way, some light will be shed in our sufferings. And that is why, when Job really surrendered to God, God restitutes all that was lost in the life of Job. He gives him double the riches. He gives him back his daughters and sons. And Job enjoys his life for long years and dies a happy death. Dear friends, here is a very powerful message to all of us. Today, when we identify ourselves with Job, because we all of us suffer in one way or the other, maybe unemployment, maybe old age, maybe a toothache or headache, or a particular family member who is disturbing, or many other situations in our life, but we need to find an answer. How can we find an answer? We can find an answer when we look into the entire situation of our life. Now, when God took Job through this tour of the universe, when we consider ourselves, We all of us are speck of dust in the whole of the universe. We are speck of dust. But then that does not mean that God does not take care of us. But for every suffering of ours, there is a meaning attached. Of course, there are many people out there who perhaps do not believe in God. They will not find a sense for that suffering, because sometimes people ask, if there is a powerful God, who is a generous God, who is a good God, why can't He avoid all those wars and violence? Why can't He put a stop to all these tragedies, these natural calamities where thousands of people die? He could have all protected people. He could have avoided all those disasters. We are not able to answer those, because God sees a bigger program. God has a big project. But if I were to suffer today or tomorrow, I would not look into that unless I have faith. I will always concentrate on my own suffering, say that, oh, why do I suffer? Why do I have to suffer all these tragedies in my life? Certainly I will ask, I am preaching to you, yes. But then it all depends on our faith experience with God. That's why we find in the life of Job how miserable he was, how tragically he was reduced to a small creature, suffering every bit of his life. And that's why today's reading, the first reading taken from chapter 7, verse 1 to 7, from the book of Job, here very clearly he says, as the laborer desires his wages, as the slave is looking for the shadow, my life is swiftly gone like a weaver's shuttle. Everything is empty and I am going to die without any hope. So that was the feeling, terrible feeling of Job. Difference in my priestly ministry of 27 years, I have met a lot of people. Sometimes it was impossible for me to utter a word of comfort to these people. When people were questioning me, when people totally disfigured, I cannot explain to you today how those people were looking. People who were completely lost, people who lost both hands and legs, people blind, people who have lost their entire families, only one or two persons alive. On such occasions, I was not able to give them any word of consolation, but extend my hand on their head or shoulder and maintain a stoic silence. Not able to give anything. Because only the answer that could be given is from God. Human answers cannot explain why a person would suffer that kind of tragedies, that kind of excruciating pain and tortures. Now, in the past weeks we have noticed, some people were imprisoned and some people were tortured to death. We might ask a simple question, why? Why? Who can answer it? God will answer it in the storm. I am not able to answer to that. Therefore, dear friends, here is a point for our reflection, is this. On our part, we must make every effort is to pray for those people who suffer. Now, how many people are suffering? Why should we go far away? Sometimes we need to know, in our own parish, there are people who count their days, who live in emptiness, anxiety, depression, and total suffering as Job was suffering. And that's why our obligation as Christian community to pray for these people. Second, is always to identify my suffering with those people who are suffering more than us. Then sometimes our sufferings will be lightened. Otherwise, what happens? Concentrating on ourselves, morning till evening, evening till morning. Oh, why do I suffer? Why do I suffer? Why do I suffer? If I open my eyes and my heart to those people who are suffering more than me, perhaps a kind of comfort may enter into myself. The third reading, Jesus coming out of the synagogue. Last Sunday we reflected, Jesus was in Capernaum in the synagogue. He cast out the demon from that person. And probably people saw his power because he was preaching with authority. and even demons obedient to him coming out of the man. And now Jesus immediately goes to the house of Peter and Andrew. Why does he go? Because it was the 6th hour. Jewish people were counting hours from morning 6. For them, our 6 a.m. is the first hour of the day. And 12 will be the 6th hour of the day. And by 6th hour of the day, the services in the synagogue will be over. People will be going out for lunch. And that was the time Jesus went to Peter's house. Most probably Peter's house he was from Galilee. His house was very close by. He goes there. And there he comes to know immediately that Peter's mother-in-law was sick with a high fever. And he heals her so quickly. Because if you go to the Old Testament, a high fever was cured in this manner. What they were doing, they were having an iron knife. That iron knife would be tied with the braided hair, and that particular iron knife with the braided hair would be tied to a thorn bush. This was in reference to Exodus chapter 3 verses 4 to 5. There you will find Moses saw that thorn bush which was burning but it was not burned. Because they had some kind of association by tying this particular iron knife 3 days continuously and bringing that knife and touching to the sick person on the 3rd day with some magical spells, this fever will be cast out. But Jesus does not go through all that procedures. He does not say any magical words or incantations, nothing. He just holds her hand and makes her get up. And that is the moment she is completely healed. The moment we see Peter's mother-in-law, a message to all of us. We all look for healing from God, but the healing that we experience in our heart is not for ourselves, it is for the service of humanity. So that's the message we get from mother-in-law of Peter. Next, what happens, at sunset, a lot of people come there. Most probably they heard Jesus speaking and preaching, casting out demons. And that was the Sabbath day. They were not supposed to accompany any sick person or carry any sick person, leave alone touching even a person who was possessed with a demon or an evil spirit. So they had to wait for the end of Sabbath. End of Sabbath was the 12th hour. That is 6 p.m. in the evening, and that is the sunset time. And that is the moment all these people gathered around the house of Peter to be healed. And Jesus heals them all. You can just imagine the day that was full of activities in the life of Jesus. And finally, Jesus goes early in the morning next day. Probably he had rest in St. Peter's house. And gets up and goes to pray alone. And they all look for Jesus. He does not ask his disciples to accompany him to go for prayer. He was alone with God early in the morning before the sun rose. He was there praying. Dear friends, in our daily lives, when we suffer, when we are occupied with such a lot of things, we need to make it a point always to get some time apart from our daily activities and spend time with God. That is what we learned from Jesus. Finally, let us abandon ourselves in the hands of the Lord. We all know how we suffer, how we need to have that courage and strength from God, His grace, that He may guide us on our path. Looking at Job, we learn a lesson that every bit of suffering in our lives has a meaning. And that meaning we will get in the context of our relationship with God. Only when we have faith in God, dear friends, every bit of suffering we suffer will have some meaning in our lives. Otherwise, we will be always frustrated with everything that happens. And therefore, let us ask the Lord during this Holy Eucharist to grant us the grace that we may surrender ourselves as Job surrendered. And as Jesus comes into our lives through the sacrament, that He may heal us, He may touch us, and He may fill us with His grace and power. Kindly rise, we prophesy.